The storm arrived without warning, as storms often do in the Carpathian Mountains. Thunder rolled across the valley like the voice of God himself, splitting the heavens with sounds that made the villagers of Valchea cross themselves and bolt their doors. Rain lashed against the crooked rooftops, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud that swallowed the wagon wheels and made even the bravest horses rear in terror. In the center of the village stood the mayor's manor, a structure of dark stone that rose above the humble cottages like a monument to ambition. Inside, Octavian Gregor sat in his study, a room lined with ledgers and deeds that documented his ownership of nearly every plot of land within 20 miles. He was a man in his middle years, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a face that had once been handsome before excess and cruelty had carved their marks into it. His eyes were small and calculating, the eyes of a man who measured every human interaction in terms of profit and loss. He lifted a glass of wine to his lips, savoring the taste. It was imported from France, far too expensive for any of his tenants to afford, which made it taste all the sweeter. Outside the storm raged, but here in his manor he was safe, warm, powerful. The walls were thick, the fires were bright. The wine cellar was full. What did he care if the peasants huddled in their hovels, listening to the thunder and wondering if their roofs would hold? A knock at the door interrupted his satisfaction. He frowned, setting down his glass. Who would dare disturb him at this hour in this weather? His servant, a bent old man named Vasily, shuffled into the room with an apologetic expression. The mayor asked what it was. Vasily explained that there was a stranger at the door, a traveler seeking shelter from the storm. The mayor's frown deepened. A stranger at this hour, in this weather. His first instinct was suspicion. Strangers brought trouble, questions, complications. They upset the careful balance of power he had spent years constructing. He asked what the stranger looked like. Vasily described a tall man, perhaps 40 years of age, dressed entirely in black. He wore a long traveling cloak, also black, and carried no visible weapons. His manner was courteous, but there was something in his eyes, something that made the old servant uncomfortable, though he could not say exactly what it was. The mayor considered this. A well-dressed traveler might have money. Money could be extracted through hospitality fees, through inflated prices for food and lodging, through a dozen small frauds that he had perfected over the years. On the other hand, a man who traveled alone through these mountains in such weather was either very foolish or very dangerous. Octavian Gregor had not maintained his position by taking unnecessary risks. He told Vasily to inform the stranger that there was no room in the manor, that he should seek shelter elsewhere, perhaps in the church. The servant hesitated, then mentioned that Father Constantine had locked the church doors at sunset, as he always did when storms came. The priest believed that evil things walked abroad in such weather, and he would not open the doors until dawn. The mayor's expression hardened. Then the stranger could sleep in a barn or under a tree, or in whatever hole he could find. This was not his concern. He was not running an inn for every vagrant who wandered through the mountains. Vasily bowed and withdrew, and the mayor returned to his wine. But his satisfaction had been disrupted. He found himself thinking about the stranger, about those eyes that had unsettled his servant. Vasily was a simple man, easily frightened by shadows and superstitions, but he had served the Gregor family for 40 years and had a sense for trouble. The mayor rose from his chair and walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain to look out into the storm. The village square was empty, a sheet of water reflecting the occasional flash of lightning. The houses were dark, shuttered tight against the weather, and there, standing in the center of the square, directly in front of the manor, was a figure in black. The stranger had not left. He stood perfectly still, seemingly oblivious to the rain that poured down upon him. His cloak did not billow in the wind. His posture did not shift or adjust. He simply stood, facing the manor as if waiting for something. The mayor felt a flicker of unease, which immediately transformed into anger. How dare this vagrant stand there in front of his home as if in judgment? Who did he think he was? Octavian Gregor was the law in this village. He decided who stayed and who left. He decided who ate and who went hungry. He had the ear of the regional governor and the protection of the church. This stranger was nothing, a nobody, a piece of debris washed up by the storm. He threw open the window, letting in a blast of cold wind and rain. He shouted down to the figure, demanding to know what he wanted, why he was still standing there. The stranger did not respond immediately. Then, slowly, he raised his head, and even from this distance, even through the darkness and the rain, the mayor could see his eyes. They were not the eyes of a beggar or a vagrant. They were not even the eyes of an angry man. They were ancient eyes, patient eyes, the eyes of something that had seen empires rise and fall, that had watched generations of men like Octavian Gregor strut and posture and return to dust. And in those eyes was a terrible amusement, as if the stranger found the mayor's bluster entertaining, in the way one might be entertained by a performing dog. The stranger spoke, and his voice carried clearly despite the storm, despite the distance, as if he were standing right beside the mayor's ear. He said that he had asked for nothing but shelter from the storm, a courtesy that even the poorest shepherd would extend to a traveler. He had not demanded, had not threatened, had not imposed. He had simply asked, and he had been refused. The mayor's face reddened. He shouted that this was his village, his land, his domain. The stranger had no rights here, no claims, no authority. If he did not like the hospitality offered, he was free to leave, to go back to wherever he came from, to trouble someone else with his presence. The stranger tilted his head slightly, and that terrible amusement in his eyes deepened. He said that he appreciated the mayor's clarity, his honesty about the nature of his power. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that he would accept the mayor's judgment. He would seek shelter elsewhere. The abandoned castle in the mountains, perhaps. It had been empty for many years, but it still had a roof and walls, and a certain grandeur that appealed to him. The mayor felt his blood run cold. The castle. No one spoke of the castle, not if they were wise. It had stood empty for 300 years, ever since the last lord of Valchia had vanished under circumstances that the village elders refused to discuss. Local legend said that the castle was cursed, that evil had been done there, that anyone who spent a night within its walls would never see the dawn. Peasants avoided even the road that led to it, taking long detours through the forest rather than pass beneath its shadow. He asked who the stranger was, what his business was in these mountains. The stranger smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. He said that his name was not important, that names were things for the living to concern themselves with. As for his business, he had come to reclaim something that belonged to him, something that had been held in trust for far too long. Then, before the mayor could respond, the stranger turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm as suddenly as he had appeared. The mayor stood at the window, rain soaking his expensive doublet, staring out into the darkness. His hands, he realized, were shaking. He slammed the window shut and returned to his desk, but the wine had lost its taste. He tried to tell himself that the stranger was just a madman, a vagrant with delusions of grandeur, that the castle would claim him as it had claimed others who were foolish enough to seek shelter there. But he could not forget those eyes, that voice, that terrible certainty. In the village below, in a small cottage near the edge of the square, Eleanor Gregor sat by her window and watched the storm. She was 20 years old, with her mother's fair hair and delicate features, but without the hardness that life in Valchia seemed to carve into every face. Her mother had died when she was young, taken by fever, and she had been raised by servants and tutors under her father's distant supervision. She had seen the stranger standing in the square. She had seen her father open the window and shout down at him, and she had felt in that moment a strange pull of sympathy. The stranger had looked so alone, so terribly alone, standing there in the rain. It seemed cruel to turn him away, to send him out into the storm to find shelter in an abandoned ruin. Her father had taught her that kindness was weakness, that the strong took what they wanted, and the weak suffered as they must. But her mother, in the brief years before her death, had taught her something different. She had taught her that compassion was the mark of true nobility, that power without mercy was merely tyranny, that even the lowest beggar carried within him a soul as precious as any king's. Elena rose from her chair and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She knew what her father would say if he found out, but she could not help herself. She descended the stairs quietly, avoiding the creaking boards that would alert the servants, and slipped out through the kitchen door into the storm. The rain soaked her immediately, plastering her hair to her face, but she pressed on, heading toward the north road that led up into the mountains. She carried a small bundle of bread and cheese, wrapped in cloth, and a flask of water. It was not much, but it was something. Perhaps the stranger would accept it. Perhaps he would not, but at least she would have tried. The path was treacherous in the darkness, slippery with mud and broken by fallen branches. Lightning flashed, illuminating the landscape in stark white bursts that revealed more than they concealed. The forest pressed close on either side, ancient trees with twisted branches that seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. Local children told stories about these woods, about things that walked on two legs but were not men, about voices that called you deeper into the darkness, about paths that led nowhere and everywhere at once. Eleanor pushed these thoughts aside and kept walking. The castle was perhaps an hour's journey from the village, perched on a crag that overlooked the valley. She had never been there, had never wanted to go there. But tonight fear seemed less important than the simple act of giving help to someone who needed it. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw it. The castle rose from the mountainside like a great black tooth, its towers silhouetted against the storm clouds. Lightning played around its highest peaks, and for a moment Elena thought she saw lights in the windows, pale and cold, like corpse candles in a graveyard. Then the darkness returned, and she wondered if she had imagined it. The gates stood open, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Beyond them, a courtyard stretched away toward the main keep, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken stone. Elena hesitated at the threshold, her courage suddenly failing her. This was madness. Her father was right. The stranger was nothing to her. She should turn back, return to the safety of her home, forget this foolish impulse. But then she heard it. A sound faint and distant coming from somewhere within the castle. It might have been the wind, but it sounded like music. A violin, perhaps, or a viola, playing a melody so beautiful and so sad that it made her heart ache. The music drew her forward, through the gates, across the courtyard, up the worn stone steps to the great door of the keep. The door was ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside, and the music grew louder, clearer, filling the vast entrance hall with its haunting melody. Candles had been lit, hundreds of them, covering every surface, their light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The hall was magnificent despite its decay, with soaring ceilings and carved pillars, and a grand staircase that curved upward into darkness. At the far end of the hall, near a massive fireplace where flames now burned bright and warm, stood the stranger. He had removed his wet cloak and now wore a suit of black velvet that looked like it belonged to another century. In his hands, he held a violin, and he played with such skill and such sorrow that Elena found tears streaming down her face without knowing why. He saw her and stopped playing. For a long moment they looked at each other across the candle-lit hall, and Elena realized that she had made a terrible mistake. This was no ordinary traveler. This was something else, something that wore the shape of a man, but was not truly human. She could see it now in the way he stood, too still, too perfect, like a statue given breath. She could see it in his eyes, which held depths that no mortal eyes should contain. He asked why she had come. His voice was gentle, curious, without threat or anger. Elena found herself unable to speak. The bundle of bread and cheese fell from her nerveless fingers. She tried to back toward the door, but her legs would not obey her. She was caught, frozen, like a rabbit before a serpent. The stranger set down his violin and walked toward her, and with each step Elena's heart beat faster. He stopped a few paces away and studied her face with an expression that might have been sadness. He said that she should not have come, that this place was not for the living, that she had put herself in terrible danger through a simple act of kindness. Eleanor forced herself to speak. She said that she had only wanted to help, that it seemed wrong to send someone into the storm with nothing. The stranger smiled, and this time there was no cruelty in it, only a deep weariness. He said that kindness was a rare thing in this world, rarer than gold or jewels, and that those who possessed it often suffered for it. He asked her name. She told him. He repeated it softly, as if tasting it, and said that she reminded him of someone he had known long ago, someone who had shown him kindness when he did not deserve it. Then he told her that she must leave now, immediately, before the dawn found her in this place. He said that he would not harm her, but there were other things in this castle, old things, hungry things. And even he might not be able to protect her if they woke. Elena found her courage returning. She asked who he was, why he had come back to this place. The stranger's smile faded. He said that he was the rightful lord of this land, though his name had been forgotten and his deeds had been twisted into legend. He had been away for a long time, wandering the world, trying to escape what he had become, but the hunger always brought him back, the terrible hunger that could never truly be satisfied, and now he had returned to claim what was his. She asked what he was. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw centuries of pain and loss and loneliness. He said that he was damned, that he was a creature of darkness who had traded his soul for immortality and found the bargain wanting. He said that he had been a man once, with hopes and dreams and a heart that beat warm in his chest, but that had been so long ago that he could barely remember what it felt like. Elena understood then, and the understanding should have filled her with terror. But instead she felt only a profound sadness. She said that she was sorry, that no one should have to carry such a burden. The stranger laughed, but it was a bitter sound. He said that pity was wasted on him, that he had earned his damnation 1,000 times over, that the blood on his hands would fill an ocean. But Elena did not run. She did not scream. She simply stood there in the candlelight and looked at him with those clear, compassionate eyes, and something stirred in the stranger's chest, something he had thought long dead. For a moment, just a moment, he remembered what it was to be human. He told her again that she must leave, and this time his voice was urgent, almost pleading. The night was passing, and with it, his control. The hunger was rising, whispering in his mind, reminding him how easy it would be, how sweet her blood would taste. She was so close, so warm, so alive. Elena nodded and turned toward the door. But before she left, she looked back at him one last time and said that she would pray for him, that even the damned deserved someone to pray for them. Then she was gone, running out into the storm, leaving the stranger alone in his candle-lit hall with only the echoes of the violin and the memory of kindness. He stood there for a long time after she left, staring at the spot where she had stood. Then he picked up his violin and began to play again, and the music that filled the castle was more beautiful and more sorrowful than anything the mountains had heard in 300 years. In the village, Octavian Gregor paced his study, unable to sleep. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a creeping dread that wine could not wash away. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. He had come to reclaim something that belonged to him. But what? What could a vagrant claim in this valley that Octavian did not already own? The mayor walked to his desk and pulled out a ledger, the one that contained the deeds and titles to all the land in Valchea. He ran his finger down the entries, checking each one, confirming his ownership. Houses, farms, mills, forests, everything belonged to him through purchase, foreclosure, or inheritance. Everything except one piece of property, the castle. The castle had no deed, no title, no owner of record. It had belonged to the old lords, the ones who had ruled this valley before the Gregors, before living memory. Their line had ended in blood and mystery, and the castle had stood empty ever since, claimed by no one because everyone feared to claim it. But what if the stranger's claim was legitimate? What if he was impossibly somehow connected to those ancient lords? If he could prove ownership of the castle, he would own the entire valley by ancient right. All the deeds and titles that Octavian had spent a lifetime accumulating would become void, worthless paper. No, it was impossible. The old lords were dust, their line extinct. The stranger was a madman or a con artist, nothing more. But even as he told himself this, Octavian felt the dread growing stronger. He had built his power on fear and control, on keeping the peasants cowed and the church compliant. But fear was a fragile thing. If the people believed that the old lords had returned, if they thought there was an alternative to his rule, everything he had built could come crashing down. He would have to act quickly, decisively. The stranger had to be dealt with before he could establish himself in the castle, before he could begin spreading doubts and rumors. Octavian had resources. He had money, men, weapons. He would gather them at first light and march on the castle, and he would burn it to the ground if necessary with the stranger inside it. Outside, the storm began to weaken. The thunder grew distant. The rain softened to a drizzle. Dawn was still hours away, but Octavian Gregor did not sleep. He sat at his desk planning, calculating, preparing for war against an enemy he did not understand. And in the castle on the mountain, the stranger put down his violin, closed his eyes and waited for the confrontation he knew was coming. The battle for Valsea had begun. Dawn broke over Valcha with a pale, reluctant light that seemed to struggle through the lingering storm clouds. The village stirred slowly, doors creaking open as villagers emerged to assess the damage from the night's tempest. Broken shutters, flooded cellars, fallen branches scattered across the muddy streets. But these were familiar problems, ordinary problems, the kind that could be fixed with hammer and nail and hard work. Father Constantine stood in the doorway of his church, a small stone building that occupied one corner of the village square. He was an old man, thin as a rail, with white hair and a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He had been the priest of Valcha for 40 years, and in that time he had baptized every child, married every couple, and buried every corpse. He knew the secrets of this valley, the old stories that were whispered but never spoken aloud, the truth that lay beneath the legends. He had not slept. All night he had knelt before the altar, praying, listening to the storm rage outside and feeling in his bones that something had changed. The air felt different this morning, heavier, charged with a presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He could smell it, faint but unmistakable, the scent of old earth and older blood, the smell of the grave opened. A figure approached across the square. Elena Gregor, soaked to the skin despite the storm having passed, her hair plastered to her face, her dress muddy and torn. She walked like someone in a dream, her eyes distant, her steps unsteady. Father Constantine hurried toward her, calling her name, asking what had happened, where she had been. She looked at him as if seeing him from a great distance. She said she had gone to the castle, that she had taken food to the stranger her father had turned away. The priest's face went pale. He grabbed her shoulders, asking if the stranger had touched her, if he had done anything to her. Elena shook her head slowly. She said he had been kind, that he had told her to leave, that he had warned her of danger. Father Constantine pulled her into the church and closed the door. He made her sit in a pew near the altar, where the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows painted her face in shades of red and blue. He asked her to describe everything, every word, every detail, no matter how small, and as she spoke, his worst fears were confirmed. The stranger was not a stranger. He was the master, the original master, the one whose name had been struck from every record, whose portrait had been burned, whose very existence the village had tried to forget for 300 years. Count Dracula, lord of the castle, drinker of blood, the undead thing that walked in human shape. He had returned to claim his domain. Elena listened to the priest's words with growing horror. She said it was impossible that the stranger had seemed sad, weary, almost human in his suffering. Father Constantine shook his head. Demons were masters of deception, he said. They could wear any face, speak any words, evoke any emotion. The creature in the castle was damned, beyond redemption, beyond salvation. The only mercy that could be offered to him was the mercy of destruction. But Elena could not reconcile the priest's words with what she had seen. The stranger's eyes had held such pain, such terrible loneliness. Could something truly evil suffer, as he seemed to suffer? Could a demon play music of such beauty and sorrow? She voiced these questions, and Father Constantine's expression softened slightly. He told her an old story, one that few in the village remembered anymore. Once, long ago, the Count had been a man, a mortal man, a warrior who had defended these lands against invaders. He had been brave and noble, beloved by his people, but in his pride, he had sought power beyond death, had made a bargain with dark forces, had chosen immortality over his eternal soul, and the curse had taken everything from him, his humanity, his honor, his capacity for love. All that remained was hunger and darkness, and an existence that stretched on forever, empty of meaning. Eleanor asked if there was no hope for him, no possibility of redemption. The priest was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said that the church taught that all souls could be saved through true repentance and God's grace, but that a creature like the Count had placed himself beyond the reach of grace through his own choices. The only way to free him would be to destroy the body that housed his cursed spirit, to return him to the grave, and pray that God would have mercy on whatever remained of his soul. They were interrupted by a commotion outside, voices raised in anger and fear, the sound of horses, the clatter of weapons. Eleanor and the priest hurried to the door and saw that a crowd had gathered in the square. At its center stood Octavian Gregor, mounted on a black stallion, surrounded by a dozen men armed with pitchforks, axes, and old swords that had been pulled down from attic walls. The mayor was addressing the crowd, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. He told them that a dangerous criminal had taken refuge in the castle, a vagrant who claimed ownership of their lands, who threatened everything they had built. This criminal had to be dealt with immediately, before he could gather supporters, before he could spread his poison. The mayor called for volunteers, promised that any man who joined him would be rewarded, that the village would be safe once this threat was eliminated. Father Constantine stepped forward and tried to speak, tried to warn the mayor about what they were truly facing, but Octavian cut him off. The mayor said that he had no time for superstitious nonsense, that this was a matter of law and order, not religion. The priest persisted, saying that the castle should be left alone, that some doors were better left closed, that there were powers in this world that men could not fight with steel and fire. Octavian's face reddened with anger. He accused the priest of cowardice, of hiding behind old wives' tales instead of defending the village. The crowd murmured, some agreeing with the mayor, others looking uncertain. The mayor pressed his advantage, reminding them of all he had done for the village, all the order he had maintained, all the protection he had provided. Would they abandon him now, when he needed them most? One by one, men stepped forward to join the mayor's band. Young men looking for glory, desperate men looking for the promised reward, angry men looking for someone to blame for their hard lives. Within minutes, Octavian had assembled a force of 20 armed men. He gave orders to gather torches, oil, anything that would burn. They would march on the castle within the hour. Elena pushed through the crowd toward her father, calling out to him, begging him to reconsider. Octavian looked down at her from his horse, and his expression was cold. He asked where she had been last night, why she had left the house in the storm. Elena hesitated, and in that hesitation he saw the truth. His face twisted with rage. She had gone to the castle, had spoken with the stranger, had perhaps even conspired with him. He ordered 2 of his men to take her home and lock her in her room. She was not to leave, not to speak to anyone, not until this matter was resolved. Elena struggled as the men grabbed her arms, protesting that her father was making a terrible mistake, that he did not understand what he was facing. But Octavian had already turned away, issuing orders, organizing his men, preparing for the assault. Father Constantine watched as the mayor's force assembled, a sick feeling in his stomach. These men had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were facing a vagrant, a charlatan, perhaps at worst, a dangerous criminal. They did not understand that they were marching against something that had survived for centuries, that had destroyed armies, that viewed human life as a farmer views cattle. They would die, most of them, and their deaths would be on his conscience because he had failed to make them understand. He retreated into his church and knelt before the altar. He prayed for the souls of the men who were about to die, for the village that would soon know terror, and for the damned creature in the castle who had once been a man. Then he rose and began to prepare. If the mayor's assault failed, as he knew it would, there would be wounded to tend, last rites to perform, and a much longer battle to fight. In the castle, the Count stood at a high window watching the village below. He could see the crowd gathering, could sense their fear and anger like a living thing. He had known this would happen, had expected it. Men like Octavian Gregor always responded to threats with violence because violence was the only language they truly understood. It was almost tedious in its predictability. He could stop them easily. He could descend from the castle before they ever reached the gates, could tear through them like a wolf through sheep. They had no weapons that could harm him, no knowledge that could protect them. Their torches and their swords were children's toys. He could paint the valley red with their blood and barely exert himself. But he would not. That was the old way, the way of the monster he had been, and he had grown weary of it. Century after century of blood and death, and what had it brought him? Nothing but emptiness. The hunger was never truly satisfied. The power was meaningless without purpose. The immortality was a curse, not a gift. The girl's face appeared in his mind. Eleanor, who had braved the storm to bring kindness to a stranger. Eleanor, who had looked at him with compassion instead of fear. Eleanor, who reminded him of what he had lost, of what he had been before the darkness claimed him. He turned from the window and descended the grand staircase to the entrance hall. The candles had burned down to stubs, but morning light filtered through the high windows, illuminating the dust and decay. This had been a beautiful place once, full of life and laughter and warmth. Now it was a tomb, a monument to his damnation. There was a room on the ground floor that he had not entered in 300 years. He walked to it now and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a portrait. It showed a man in armor, young and strong, with clear eyes and a proud bearing. The man in the portrait looked nothing like the creature the Count had become. That man had been human, mortal, capable of love and hope and all the things that made life worth living. The Count stood before the portrait for a long time, remembering. He had been a warrior, a defender of Christendom, a man who had faced the armies of the East and never wavered. He had loved a woman once, with all the fierce passion of youth. Her name had been Maria, and she had died while he was away at war, had thrown herself from these very walls rather than let herself be captured by invaders. That was when the darkness had first whispered to him, had offered him the power to protect his lands forever, to never lose anything again to death or time. He had accepted, fool that he was. He had drunk from the cup of corruption and gained immortality, but lost everything that made immortality worth having. Maria was gone, his humanity was gone, and all that remained was an endless succession of nights filled with hunger and blood and loneliness. A sound reached his ears. Footsteps, many of them, coming up the mountain road, the mayor's war party. The Count closed the door on the portrait and returned to the entrance hall. He could hear their voices now, rough and frightened beneath their bravado. They were trying to work up their courage for what they thought would be a simple task. He considered his options. He could hide, let them search the castle and find nothing, let them convince themselves that the stranger had fled. But that would only delay the inevitable. Or he could meet them, speak with them, try to make them understand. But men like Octavian did not listen to words. They only understood demonstrations of power. Very well, he would give them a demonstration. Not one of violence, but of something else. Something that might plant a seed of doubt in their minds, that might make them question their certainty. He was tired of being a monster. Perhaps it was time to remember what it meant to be something else. He opened the great door and stood at the top of the stone steps, waiting as the mayor's party crossed the courtyard. They stopped when they saw him, forming a ragged line, their weapons held uncertainly. They had expected to have to search for him, to drag him from some hiding place. They had not expected him to simply be standing there waiting, as if he had known they were coming. Octavian Gregor rode to the front of the group, his horse dancing nervously. The animal could sense what the men could not, could smell the wrongness, the death that clung to the figure on the steps. The mayor had to fight to control his mount as he glared up at the stranger. He announced that the stranger was trespassing on land that belonged to the village, that he had no right to be here, that he would leave immediately or face the consequences. The Count regarded him with an expression of mild curiosity. He asked by what authority the mayor made this claim. Octavian pulled out a sheaf of papers, deeds and titles, waving them like a weapon. By these authorities, by the law, by right of ownership. The Count descended the steps slowly, and the men backed away despite themselves. He said that papers and laws were recent inventions, barely a few centuries old. The castle had stood for 1,000 years. His family had held these lands for twice that long. What were the mayor's papers against such antiquity? What were his deeds against blood and history? Octavian's face purpled with rage. He shouted that history meant nothing, that the old lords were gone, that the land belonged to those who worked it, who defended it, who had the strength to hold it. The stranger was alone, outnumbered, facing armed men. He should choose his words more carefully. The Count smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. He said that he had faced armies of thousands and emerged victorious. He had seen empires crumble to dust. He had walked through centuries as these men would walk through a single day. What threat did a handful of peasants with farm tools pose to him? One of the men, braver or more foolish than the rest, rushed forward with a pitchfork. The Count moved faster than the eye could follow, and suddenly the man was on the ground, his weapon broken, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. He screamed, and the sound echoed off the castle walls. The other men froze, their courage evaporating. But the Count did not press his advantage. He released the injured man and stepped back, making no move to pursue. He said that he had no desire to hurt them, that they could leave now with their wounded, and no more blood would be spilled. He offered them mercy, which was more than they had offered him. Octavian, seeing his men wavering, shouted that this was exactly what he had warned them about. The stranger was dangerous, possibly a demon, certainly a threat to everything they held dear. They had to act now, while they still had numbers on their side. He ordered his men to spread out, to surround the stranger, to attack all at once. But Father Constantine's warnings had taken root in some of the men's minds. They had seen the stranger move, had seen the terrible speed and strength. They were farmers and craftsmen, not soldiers. Several of them began to back away, making excuses, saying they had families to think of, that this was not what they had signed up for. Octavian raged at them, calling them cowards, threatening to have them arrested, to take their lands, to ruin them. But fear was stronger than greed or loyalty. One by one, the men slipped away, returning down the mountain road, leaving the mayor with only his most loyal followers, perhaps 5 men in total, all of them looking increasingly uncertain. The Count watched this display with something approaching pity. He told the mayor that his power was an illusion, built on fear and maintained through cruelty. When true danger appeared, when real courage was required, such power evaporated like morning mist. The men who followed him did so because they had no choice, not because they believed in him. Octavian, desperate now, raised his sword and spurred his horse forward. It was a stupid, suicidal attack, born of rage and humiliation rather than strategy. The Count could have killed him easily, could have pulled him from the saddle and broken his neck with a flick of his wrist. But he did not. Instead, he caught the horse's bridle and brought the animal to a halt. He looked up at the mayor and said that he would let him live, not because he deserved mercy, but because his death would accomplish nothing. The mayor would return to his village, would tell everyone what he had seen, and that story would spread fear more effectively than any violence. Fear would undermine Octavian's authority far more thoroughly than death. Then the Count released the horse, and the terrified animal bolted, carrying the mayor down the mountain at a breakneck pace. The remaining men followed, running, stumbling, abandoning their weapons in their haste to escape. Within minutes, the castle was empty again, silent, except for the sound of the wind through the broken stones. The Count stood alone in the courtyard, feeling the morning sun warm on his face. It hurt, slightly, as sunlight always did, but he forced himself to endure it. He had spent so many centuries in darkness. Perhaps it was time to remember what light felt like, even if it burned. In the village, chaos erupted. The men who had fled the castle told wild stories of the stranger's inhuman speed, his terrible strength, his eyes that seemed to look into your soul. The mayor returned in a state of shock, barely coherent, raving about demons and the old lords returning. Father Constantine tried to restore calm, but the damage was done. Fear had been planted, and fear grew quickly in the fertile soil of superstition. Elena, locked in her room, heard the commotion and knew that her worst fears had been realized. Her father had confronted the stranger, and from the sounds below, the confrontation had not gone well. She pressed her face against the window, looking out at the square where people gathered in frightened clusters, pointing toward the mountain, making the sign of the cross. She thought of the stranger in his empty castle, alone with his sorrow and his hunger. She thought of her father, his power crumbling, his certainty shattered. She thought of the priest, preparing for a battle that had already been lost centuries ago. And she thought of herself, trapped between these forces, unable to help anyone, unable to change anything. But she was wrong. She could change everything. She did not know it yet, but her compassion had already begun to work on the Count like water on stone, slowly, imperceptibly. wearing away at the hardness that centuries of damnation had created. She had reminded him of what he had lost, and that reminder was more powerful than any weapon, more dangerous than any hunter. The battle for Valchia had entered its second phase, and the outcome was far from certain. Night was coming, and with it the Count's true power would awaken. But so too would his hunger, and the village had no defenses against what walked in darkness. Father Constantine knew this, and as the sun began to set, he made his preparations. He would do what the mayor could not. He would face the monster, not with steel or fire, but with faith, and he would discover whether faith alone was enough to stand against eternal damnation. The long night was about to begin. Night fell over Valchia like a shroud, and with it came a silence deeper than any the village had known. No dogs barked, no children played in the streets, no voices carried from the tavern. Every door was bolted, every window shuttered, every candle carefully shielded lest its light attract unwanted attention. The villagers huddled in their homes and waited, though few could have said exactly what they were waiting for. Father Constantine stood in his church, surrounded by the tools of his trade, holy water in crystal vials, blessed by bishops in Rome, crosses of silver and wood, some ancient, passed down through generations of priests, fragments of bone wrapped in silk, relics of saints who had faced evil and triumphed, and bread, simple unleavened bread, consecrated that very morning, the body of Christ made manifest in flour and water. He had sent word to the bishop, but it would be weeks before help could arrive, if it arrived at all. The church moved slowly, weighted down by bureaucracy and skepticism. By the time anyone responded to his urgent letters, this matter would be resolved one way or another. He was alone, as priests had always been alone when facing the darkness that lurked at the edges of the world. A young acolyte, a boy barely 15 named Stefan, helped him prepare. The boy's hands shook as he filled the thurible with incense, as he laid out the vestments, as he polished the great brass cross that would be carried in procession. Stefan asked if they were truly going to the castle, if they were truly going to face the thing that lived there. Father Constantine nodded slowly. They had no choice. Evil unchallenged grew stronger. Evil confronted, even if not defeated, was at least contained. The boy asked if they would die. The priest considered lying, offering false comfort, but decided the boy deserved truth. He said that death was possible, even likely. But dying in the service of God was not the worst fate a man could face. Living in fear, allowing evil to flourish unchallenged, abandoning one's duty, these were worse than death. These were the true damnations. Stefan straightened his shoulders and said that he would go, that he was not afraid. Father Constantine smiled sadly, knowing it for the lie it was, but appreciating the courage it took to tell it. They would leave within the hour as soon as the moon rose. The Count would be strongest then, but so too would their faith be most tested, and faith untested was worth nothing. In the mayor's manor, Octavian Gregor sat in darkness, a bottle of brandy at his elbow, 3/4 empty. His wife had left him years ago, fleeing to relatives in Vienna. His servants avoided him, sensing the dangerous edge to his mood. He was alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts were bitter company. Everything he had built was crumbling. The men who had followed him to the castle were spreading stories, each more fantastical than the last. Some said the stranger had moved like smoke, had appeared and disappeared at will. Others claimed he had lifted a horse with one hand, had spoken in a voice that made your bones ache. The stories would grow with each retelling, and with them would grow the conviction that Octavian Gregor was a fool who had led brave men into danger for nothing but his own pride. He had tried to reassert his authority, had threatened and blustered, but the fear in the village was stronger than any threat he could make. People avoided his eyes. They whispered when he passed. They no longer came to him with their problems and disputes. His power, which had seemed so solid that morning, had evaporated like dew. And Elena, his own daughter, had betrayed him, had gone to the stranger, had perhaps even conspired with him. She sat locked in her room, refusing food, refusing to speak to him, looking at him with disappointment and pity from his own child. It was unbearable. He took another drink, feeling the brandy burn its way down his throat. Perhaps the priest was right. Perhaps the stranger was something more than human, something that could not be fought with normal weapons. But if that was true, then what hope did any of them have? What could faith do against a creature that had survived for centuries? A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. He shouted for whoever it was to go away, but the door opened anyway. Vasily entered, his wrinkled face anxious. He said that Father Constantine was preparing to go to the castle, that he was gathering men to accompany him, that he planned to confront the stranger with the authority of the church. Octavian laughed bitterly. The priest was an even greater fool than he was. What good would prayers and holy water do against the thing in the castle? The stranger had mocked his weapons and his men. He would laugh at the priest's rituals and relics, but perhaps that was fitting. Let the church fail where he had failed. Let everyone see that neither temporal power nor spiritual authority could stand against the darkness. He waved Vasily away and reached for the bottle again, but his hand stopped halfway. An idea was forming in his mind, born of desperation and brandy and the need to salvage something from this disaster. If the priest confronted the stranger and failed, as he surely would, the blame would shift away from the mayor. The church would be discredited, and Octavian could step in as the voice of reason, the practical man who understood that accommodation was sometimes wiser than confrontation. And if by some miracle the priest succeeded, if he somehow managed to destroy or drive away the stranger, then Octavian could claim credit for supporting the church's efforts, for providing resources and encouragement. Either way, he could emerge from this crisis with his power intact, perhaps even strengthened. He stood, steadying himself against the desk, and called for Vasily. He told the servant to gather every man who still owed him loyalty, to arm them and send them to the church. They would accompany Father Constantine to the castle, not as fighters, but as witnesses. And Octavian himself would go not to lead the assault, but to ensure that whatever happened was properly documented, properly understood, properly turned to his advantage. In her locked room, Eleanor heard the renewed activity below and knew her father was plotting something. She pressed her ear to the door, listening to the footsteps, the voices, the sound of weapons being gathered. They were going back to the castle. Father Constantine was going to confront the stranger, and her father was going to let him, perhaps even encourage him, hoping that the priest would solve his problem for him. She thought of the stranger standing alone in his empty castle, waiting. He had shown mercy that morning when he could have killed everyone. He had let her father live when he had every right, every justification to take revenge. Surely that counted for something. Surely that proved he was not the mindless monster the stories made him out to be. She tried the door and found it locked, as expected. The windows were too high to jump from without serious injury. She was trapped, helpless, able only to wait and pray that somehow this night would not end in blood and tragedy. But Elena was not as helpless as she believed. The old house had secret ways, passages built during earlier times when lords needed to escape from their enemies. She had found one as a child, exploring where she was not supposed to go, and had kept it secret all these years. It led from a closet in her room down through the walls to a cellar that opened onto an alley behind the manor. She went to the closet now and pushed aside the clothes, feeling along the back wall until she found the loose panel. It swung open with a creak, revealing darkness and the smell of damp stone. She hesitated only a moment, then squeezed through the opening into a narrow passage barely wide enough for her shoulders. The descent was treacherous. The stairs were worn and broken, the walls slimy with moisture. She had no light, had to feel her way down, step by careful step, trying not to think about what might be lurking in the darkness. Rats, certainly. Spiders. Perhaps worse things, drawn by the evil that had awakened in the valley. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, she reached the cellar. The door that led to the alley was barred from the inside, but the bar was old and rusted. She struggled with it, her hands slipping on the corroded metal, until finally it gave way with a groan that sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. She pushed open the door and emerged into the night. The alley was empty, dark, filled with shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to plan. The church was on the other side of the square. She would have to cross open ground, risk being seen, but she had no choice. She had to warn the priest, had to make him understand that the stranger was not the enemy he thought. She wrapped her shawl around her head and hurried through the alleys, staying away from the main streets, moving from shadow to shadow. The village seemed deserted, but she could feel eyes watching from behind shuttered windows. Everyone knew something was about to happen. Everyone was waiting to see who would survive the night. The church loomed ahead, its stone walls solid and reassuring in the moonlight. Light spilled from the open doors, and she could hear voices inside, men speaking in low, urgent tones. She slipped inside and found perhaps a dozen men gathered around Father Constantine. They were mostly older men, men who had known the priest for decades, who trusted him more than they trusted the mayor. They were armed, but their weapons were consecrated objects, crosses and holy water, rather than swords and axes. Father Constantine saw her, and his face registered surprise and concern. He asked what she was doing there, how she had escaped. Elena said it did not matter, that she had to speak with him, that he had to listen before it was too late. The priest took her aside, away from the others, and listened as she poured out her story. She told him about going to the castle, about finding the stranger playing his violin, about the sadness in his eyes, the weariness in his voice. She described how he had warned her away, had protected her even when he could easily have harmed her. She argued that a creature of pure evil would not have shown such restraint, such concern for her safety. Father Constantine listened patiently, his expression grave. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said that what she described did not change the fundamental truth. The Count was damned, separated from God's grace by his own choices. The compassion he showed was a remnant of his former humanity, but it could not overcome the curse that bound him. He was still a creature of darkness, still driven by hunger, still capable of terrible evil, even if he chose not to exercise that capability at the moment. Elena protested that if he still had compassion, if he still remembered his humanity, then surely he could be redeemed. Father Constantine shook his head sadly. Redemption required more than memory, more than regret. It required true repentance, a turning away from evil, a willingness to accept whatever punishment God decreed. And for a creature like the Count, that punishment would be death, the final death, the destruction of the immortal body that housed his cursed soul. He asked if she truly believed the Count would accept such a fate, would willingly give up his immortality for the chance at salvation. Elena started to answer, then stopped. She did not know. She had seen his pain, his loneliness, but would that be enough to make him choose death over endless existence? She wanted to believe it would be, but she could not be certain. Father Constantine touched her shoulder gently. He said that her compassion did her credit, that the ability to see good even in the damned was a gift, but compassion alone could not save the Count. Only he could save himself, by choosing to end the curse, by accepting mortality, and facing whatever judgment awaited him. Until he made that choice, he remained a threat to every living soul in the valley. The priest turned to address the men waiting in the church. He told them that they would march to the castle and offer the Count a choice. He could leave these lands forever, never to return, and they would let him go in peace. Or he could face the church's justice, be bound by sacred ritual and destroyed by holy fire. Those were the only options. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no delay. One of the men asked what would happen if the Count refused both options, if he chose to fight instead of flee or submit. Father Constantine's face was grim. Then they would do what they could with faith and courage and whatever strength God granted them. They might fail, they might die, but they would not yield, would not retreat, would not allow evil to triumph without a fight. Octavian Gregor entered the church then, accompanied by 5 of his men. He announced that he would join the expedition, that the village needed both spiritual and temporal authority united against this threat. Father Constantine studied the mayor with barely concealed contempt. He said that the mayor was welcome to come, but that this was the church's mission, guided by faith, not by politics or personal ambition. Octavian bristled but held his tongue. He needed the priest to take the lead, to take the risk, to take the blame if things went wrong. He would follow at a safe distance and let God sort out who was right and who was wrong. The procession assembled in the church square. Father Constantine led, carrying the great brass cross. Stefan followed with the thurible, spreading incense smoke that was supposed to ward off evil. Behind them came the men with their holy water and their prayers, and behind them, keeping a careful distance, came the mayor and his guards. Elena tried to join them, but Father Constantine forbade it. This was too dangerous for a young woman, he said. She should return home, pray for their success, and trust in God's will. Elena wanted to argue, but she saw the determination in the priest's eyes and knew it would be useless. She watched as the procession left the square and began the long climb up the mountain road, their torches creating a river of light in the darkness. She stood alone in the square, feeling helpless and afraid. Everyone she cared about was walking into danger, and she could do nothing to stop them. Her father, for all his flaws, Father Constantine, who had baptized her and taught her prayers, Stefan, who was barely more than a child, and the stranger in the castle, who had shown her kindness and awakened something in her heart that she did not fully understand. She made a decision then, a reckless, foolish decision, but the only one she could live with. She would follow the procession at a distance. She could not stop what was about to happen, but she could bear witness to it. And perhaps, if things went terribly wrong, she could help somehow. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had. She slipped into the shadows and began to climb the mountain road, following the distant glow of the torches, following the sound of prayers carried on the night wind, following her heart toward whatever fate awaited them all at the castle of the damned. In that castle, the Count stood at the same high window where he had watched the mayor's assault that morning. He could see the procession climbing toward him, could hear their prayers even from this distance. They were coming to judge him, to offer him choices that were not really choices at all. Leave or die, flee or fight, accept exile or face destruction. He felt no anger, no fear, only a deep weariness and something else, something he had not felt in centuries. Hope. Not hope for himself, he was beyond that, but hope that perhaps this time, this confrontation, might lead to something different. Perhaps this priest, unlike so many before him, would understand that some fates were worse than death, that some curses could not be broken by violence or ritual, that true damnation was not the absence of God's grace, but the inability to accept it. He turned from the window and descended to the great hall. He would meet them at the gates, would hear what they had to say, and then he would make his own choice. Not the choice they offered, but a third option, one that might cost him everything, but might also, finally, bring him peace. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the valley. The procession reached the castle gates. Father Constantine raised his cross and began the prayers of exorcism. And in the shadows behind them, unseen and unknown, Helena Gregor climbed the last slope and prepared to witness a confrontation that would change everything. The hour of judgment had arrived. The gates of the castle stood open, as if in invitation. Father Constantine hesitated at the threshold, his cross held high, his lips moving in silent prayer. The courtyard beyond was empty, illuminated by moonlight that seemed brighter than it should be, casting shadows that were too dark, too deep, as if they were holes in the world rather than mere absences of light. Stefan stood close to the priest, the thurible swinging in his trembling hands, spreading incense that mingled with the mountain air. The other men formed a semicircle behind them, their faces pale, their breaths coming quick and shallow. They had been brave in the church, sustained by familiar surroundings and the comfort of numbers. Here, at the mouth of damnation, their courage wavered. Octavian and his guards remained at the rear, and the mayor made no move to press forward. He had no desire to lead, no intention of placing himself in danger. Let the priest test the waters, let faith confront darkness. He would observe and calculate and position himself to take advantage of whatever outcome emerged. Father Constantine stepped through the gates, and as he did, every torch in the procession flickered and dimmed, as if a great wind had blown through, though the air remained perfectly still. The men gasped and clutched their holy symbols tighter. The priest continued forward, his voice rising in prayer, calling upon God and all the saints to shield them from evil, to grant them strength to light their way through darkness. The Count emerged from the shadows at the base of the keep. He did not materialize or appear suddenly, but simply stepped into view as if he had been there all along, and they had only now become able to see him. He wore the same black velvet suit from the night before, and in the moonlight his face was pale as marble, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Father Constantine raised his cross higher and began the ritual of exorcism. The Latin words rolled out across the courtyard, ancient and powerful, forged over centuries of struggle against darkness. He commanded the unclean spirit to depart, to release its hold on this place, to flee before the authority of the Church and the power of Christ. The Count listened without expression. When the priest finished, he spoke quietly, his voice carrying easily across the distance. He said that he had heard those words before many times, spoken by many priests. They had never worked, they would not work now. He was not possessed by a demon. He was not controlled by some external evil. He was himself, a man who had made a choice and lived with the consequences. No ritual could change that. No prayer could undo what he had become. Father Constantine's face hardened. He said that the Count was deceiving himself, that evil always denied its own nature, that the damned always justified their damnation. The Church offered him mercy, one final chance to save whatever remained of his soul. He could leave these lands forever, could go somewhere far away where his curse would trouble no one and the Church would let him go in peace. Or he could stay and face judgment, be destroyed by holy fire and return to the earth from which he had risen. The Count smiled sadly. He asked the priest if he truly believed those were merciful options. Eternal exile, wandering from place to place, never finding rest, always bringing death and sorrow wherever he went. Or destruction, burning alive in agony, while his immortal body fought death with every fiber of its cursed existence. These were not mercy, these were simply different flavors of damnation. Father Constantine said that the Count had forfeited any right to mercy when he chose darkness over light, when he traded his soul for immortality. The consequences of that choice were not the Church's responsibility. They offered what they could. If he found it insufficient, he had no one to blame but himself. The Count's expression shifted, and for a moment something like anger flickered in his eyes. He said that the priest spoke of choices as if they were simple things, black and white, good and evil, clearly delineated. But the world was not so simple. He had been a warrior fighting to protect his people from invaders who would have slaughtered them all. He had watched his beloved die because he was not there to protect her. When darkness offered him the power to never fail again, to never lose anyone else to death, how was he supposed to refuse? What man faced with such grief, such guilt, would not have grasped at any possibility of redemption? Father Constantine replied that the road to hell was paved with good intentions, that the greatest evils were often committed by those who believed they were doing right. The Count's grief did not excuse his choice. His intentions did not absolve his sins. He had chosen damnation, and now he must face the consequences. The standoff continued, priest and vampire locked in a battle of words and wills. The men watching shifted nervously, unsure what they were supposed to do, uncertain whether this philosophical debate was the confrontation they had been promised. Octavian grew impatient. He called out that enough talking had occurred, that the time had come for action. Either the creature would leave, or it would burn. The Count turned his attention to the mayor, and his expression was one of contempt. He said that Octavian Gregor, who had built his power on the suffering of others, who had grown rich by exploiting the poor, who ruled through fear and cruelty, had no standing to judge anyone. The Count had committed terrible acts in his long existence, had taken countless lives to sustain his cursed immortality, but at least he had the excuse of being damned. What excuse did the mayor have? Octavian's face purpled with rage. He shouted that he was not on trial here, that his actions were justified by law and necessity, that maintaining order required a firm hand. The Count laughed, and it was a bitter sound. He said that tyrants always claimed necessity, always invoked order, always convinced themselves that their cruelty was justice. The difference between them was that the Count knew exactly what he was. The mayor still labored under the delusion that he was righteous. Father Constantine interrupted, saying that they had not come to debate the mayor's sins, but to address the Count's evil. He demanded a final answer. Would the Count leave peacefully or face destruction? The Count was silent for a long moment, and in that silence the tension grew unbearable. The men gripped their weapons tighter. Stefan's hands shook so violently that the thurible rattled. Even the mayor's guards shifted nervously, hands moving to sword hilts. Then the Count spoke, and his voice was weary beyond measure. He said that he would not leave. These were his lands, his home, the place where he had been born and loved and lost everything. He had wandered for 3 centuries trying to escape, but there was no escape from what he was. If the priest wanted him gone, he would have to make him go, but neither would he fight. He was tired of fighting, tired of killing, tired of the endless cycle of violence that his existence had become. If they wanted to destroy him, he would not stop them. He would stand here in his courtyard and let them try, and perhaps they would succeed. And perhaps that would finally bring him the peace he had sought for so long. Father Constantine stared at him, uncertain. This was not the response he had expected. Monsters were supposed to threaten, to attack, to give clear justification for their destruction. The Count's passive acceptance threw everything into confusion. How could the Church justify destroying something that did not fight back, that offered no resistance? One of the men, emboldened by the Count's apparent surrender, rushed forward with a wooden stake, shouting prayers and imprecations. The Count did not move, did not even look at his attacker. The man drove the stake toward the Count's chest with all his strength. It shattered. The wood splintered into 1,000 pieces, and the man fell backward, clutching his hands, which were bleeding from splinters. The Count remained standing, untouched, his expression unchanged. He said quietly that mortal weapons could not harm him, that stakes and swords and crosses were children's toys. Only certain rituals, certain holy fires prepared in very specific ways, could destroy his immortal body. Father Constantine understood then the trap they had walked into. The Count was not surrendering. He was challenging them to go through with what they had threatened. He was calling their bluff, forcing them to either commit to murder or back down. And destruction by holy fire required preparation, required materials they did not have, required rituals that took hours to complete. The priest said that if the Count would not fight and would not leave, then they were at an impasse. He could not destroy the Count without proper preparation, but neither could he simply leave him here to threaten the village. They needed time to prepare the proper rituals, to gather the necessary materials. The Count agreed. He said he would remain in the castle and not venture into the village. He gave his word, his oath, and despite everything, despite all reason, Father Constantine found himself believing it. There was something in the Count's eyes, some remnant of the honor he must have possessed as a living man, that made his promise credible. But Octavian was not satisfied. He shouted that oaths from demons meant nothing, that they were being fools to trust the creature. They should burn the castle now with the Count inside it and worry about proper rituals later. Father Constantine turned on him angrily, saying that the Church did not work that way, that there were rules and procedures even in matters of exorcism and destruction. To act hastily, to rely on crude violence, would be to descend to the level of the thing they opposed. While they argued, Elena slipped through the gates. She had been watching from the shadows, had heard every word, had seen the Count's weariness and the priest's confusion and her father's rage. She moved quietly, using skills learned in childhood games of hide and seek, until she stood between the two groups, facing the Count. Everyone fell silent, shocked by her sudden appearance. Father Constantine called out to her to get back, to get to safety. Octavian roared with fury, demanding to know how she had escaped, threatening punishment, but Elena ignored them all. She looked only at the Count, and he looked back at her with something like surprise in his ancient eyes. She asked him why. Why had he come back after so long? Why now, when he could have stayed away, could have avoided all this confrontation and pain? The Count studied her face, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. He said that he had tried to stay away, had spent centuries wandering the world, searching for something that might fill the emptiness inside him. But the hunger always brought him back. Not the hunger for blood, though that was terrible enough. The hunger for home, for connection, for meaning. He had thought that perhaps, after 300 years, the world might have changed enough that he could find a place in it. Eleanor said that killing him would not solve anything, that it would just be another death added to all the others, another act of violence in an endless chain. The Count replied that perhaps, but at least it would be an ending. He had lived too long, seen too much, lost too much. Death, even the final death that would destroy his immortal body, might be a mercy. She said that there had to be another way, that surely even the damned could find redemption if they sought it sincerely enough. The Count shook his head. Redemption required grace, and grace could only come from God, and God had turned his face away from creatures like him long ago. That was the real curse, not the immortality or the hunger, but the absolute certainty that he was beyond salvation, beyond forgiveness, beyond hope. Father Constantine stepped forward, his expression troubled. He said that what the Count believed was heresy, that God's mercy was infinite, that no soul was beyond redemption if it truly repented. But repentance required accepting punishment, required facing the consequences of one's sins. For the Count, that meant accepting death and trusting in God's judgment. The Count asked if the priest could guarantee that God would show mercy, that there was any hope of salvation on the other side of death. Father Constantine was silent. He could not make such a guarantee. Faith required trust without certainty, belief without proof. The Count laughed bitterly and said that he had trusted once before, had believed that choosing immortality was the right thing to do, and look where that had brought him. Why should he trust again? Elena spoke then, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. She said that trust was not about certainty, but about hope. The Count had lost hope, had convinced himself that he was irredeemable, and that conviction had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But she had seen compassion in him, had witnessed his mercy, had heard his music and his sorrow. Those things could not exist in something truly evil. They were signs that his humanity remained, buried but not destroyed. The Count looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. He said that she was naive, that she did not understand what 3 centuries of darkness could do to a soul. But she insisted that she did understand, that she had seen her father become harder and crueler year by year, had watched him trade his humanity for power and wealth. If mortal men could lose themselves in just a few decades, how much worse must it be for someone cursed with endless time? But that did not mean the loss was permanent. Her father could change if he chose to, so could the Count. Octavian exploded with rage at being compared to the monster. He ordered his men to attack, to drag Elena away, to burn the castle and everything in it. The guards moved forward reluctantly, not wanting to obey but more afraid of disobeying. The Count's expression hardened, and for the first time that night, danger radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Father Constantine stepped between them, his cross raised, commanding everyone to stop in the name of God. The power in his voice surprised even himself. The guards froze. Octavian fell silent. Even the Count seemed taken aback by the sudden authority in the old priest's voice. Father Constantine said that there would be no violence this night, that they would return to the village and take time to consider what had been said, what had been revealed. The Count had given his word to remain in the castle. They would accept that word and use the time granted to prepare properly, both materially and spiritually. This was not a matter for hasty action, but for careful thought and prayer. Octavian protested, but Father Constantine cut him off sharply. The mayor's authority extended to temporal matters. This was a spiritual question, and in such matters the Church spoke with final authority. If the mayor did not like it, he could complain to the bishop, but for now he would obey or leave. The mayor's face worked with barely suppressed fury, but he knew he had lost this battle. He turned and stalked back toward the gates, his guards following. The other men looked uncertainly at Father Constantine, who nodded to them. They began to withdraw slowly, keeping their eyes on the Count as if he might attack at any moment. Father Constantine told Elena to come with him, but she shook her head. She said she wanted to stay, to talk more with the Count, to understand. The priest started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes and sighed. He told her she had until dawn, then she must return to the village. She was playing with fire, courting danger she did not fully comprehend, but he could see that forbidding her would only strengthen her resolve. The priest and his men withdrew, leaving Elena alone in the courtyard with the Count. The silence that fell was profound. The Count finally spoke, asking why she had defended him, why she risked her father's wrath and the village's condemnation for someone she barely knew. Elena said she did not know exactly, only that when she looked at him, she saw suffering that needed compassion, loneliness that needed comfort, and a soul that needed to believe it was worth saving. The Count said she was foolish, that her compassion would be her undoing. But Elena smiled and replied that perhaps foolishness was what the world needed more of, that too much wisdom had made men cruel and calculating. Sometimes the foolish choice was the right one. They talked through the remainder of the night, sitting on the steps of the keep while moonlight painted everything silver. The Count told her stories of his past, of battles fought and loves lost, of the slow descent into darkness that had consumed him. Elena listened and asked questions and refused to let him wallow in self-pity or self-hatred. She challenged his certainty that he was beyond redemption, argued that he was using his damnation as an excuse to avoid trying to be better. As dawn approached, the Count walked her to the gates. He thanked her for her kindness, for her foolish courage, for reminding him that the world still held light even if he could not fully partake of it. Elena promised she would return, that she would not give up on him, that she would find a way to help him. The Count watched her descend the mountain road as the sun began to rise. The light hurt, as it always did, but he forced himself to stand there and watch until she disappeared from view. Then he retreated into the castle, into the darkness that was his domain and his prison, and for the first time in 3 centuries, he felt something other than despair. He felt the faint, fragile stirring of hope. In the village, Octavian Gregor plotted revenge. Father Constantine prayed for guidance, and Elena returned to her room through secret passages, her heart full of determination and her mind racing with possibilities. The confrontation at the castle had resolved nothing, but it had changed everything. The battle for Valsia was no longer about power or territory. It had become something far more dangerous and far more important. It had become a battle for a single soul, and the outcome would determine the fate of everyone in the valley. 3 days passed, and the village held its breath. Father Constantine spent his time in deep study, consulting ancient texts brought from the church archives, preparing rituals that had not been performed in centuries. Elena visited the castle each night, defying her father's orders, bringing books and conversation to the Count, and Octavian Gregor, consumed by rage and humiliation, gathered what remained of his power and plotted the destruction of everything that threatened his authority. The mayor's plan was simple and brutal. If the church would not act decisively, if his daughter would not obey, if the Count would not leave, then he would take matters into his own hands. He would wait until the next new moon when darkness was absolute, and he would lead a force of hired mercenaries, men from outside the valley who cared nothing for local superstitions, to burn the castle with the Count inside it. He told no one of his intentions, not even his most trusted men, because he knew the priest would try to stop him. Elena sensed her father's mood darkening, saw him meeting with strangers in secret, heard the sound of gold-changing hands. She confronted him in his study on the 3rd evening, demanding to know what he was planning. Octavian looked at her with cold eyes and said that he was doing what needed to be done, what he should have done from the beginning. The creature in the castle had bewitched her, had corrupted her thinking with lies and manipulation. He would free her from that influence even if she hated him for it. She pleaded with him to stop, to give Father Constantine more time, to trust that there was another way. But Octavian would not listen. He told her she was confined to the manor, that guards would be posted at every door and window, that she would not be allowed to leave until this matter was finished. He called for his men, and they took her away despite her protests, locking her in her room with boards nailed over the window and a guard posted outside the door. That night, alone in her room, Elena wept with frustration and fear. She had come to care for the Count deeply, not romantically, though her father would never believe that, but as one cares for any soul in torment. She had seen glimpses of the man he had been, had witnessed his struggle against the darkness within him, had felt the profound loneliness that centuries of isolation had created. The thought of him burning, screaming in agony as holy fire consumed his immortal flesh, was unbearable. But more than that, she feared what her father's actions would cost his own soul. Murder, even the murder of a monster, committed in hatred and pride rather than necessity and sorrow, would stain him forever. He was already hard and cruel. This would complete his corruption, would transform him into something no better than the creature he sought to destroy. She tried the secret passage, but her father had discovered it. The panel had been nailed shut, the passage filled with rubble. She tried the door, but the guard outside was vigilant and loyal. She tried calling to servants from the window, but her father had warned them all that anyone who helped her would be dismissed without references, condemned to poverty. She was truly trapped. In the church, Father Constantine finished his preparations. The ritual was ready. The holy fire could be created. Blessed by prayers that dated back to the earliest days of the church, when Christianity had battled the old darkness that had ruled the world before Christ's light entered it. But the priest's heart was troubled. His conversations with Elena had planted seeds of doubt. Was destruction truly the only option? Could a creature damned for 3 centuries truly find redemption if he genuinely sought it? He decided to visit the castle one more time, to speak with the Count alone, without the mayor's interference or the men's fearful presence. He would offer one final choice, not the choice of exile or death, but a harder choice. The choice to truly repent, to accept whatever punishment God decreed, even if that punishment was eternal damnation. True repentance required facing judgment, without any guarantee of mercy, trusting in God's will, even when that will might be one's own destruction. Father Constantine climbed the mountain road as the sun set on the 3rd day. The castle loomed before him, dark and forbidding, but he felt no fear. Whatever happened within those walls, he was doing God's work, and that was enough. He entered the courtyard and found the Count waiting for him, as if he had known the priest would come. They went inside, to the great hall, where candles burned, and the Count's violin lay on a table beside an open book. Father Constantine saw that the book was a Bible, old and worn, written in Latin. The Count followed his gaze and said that he had been reading it, trying to remember what faith had felt like when he was human. The words were familiar, but the meaning had become foreign. It was like trying to recall a language he had once spoken fluently, but had not used in so long that it had become incomprehensible. Father Constantine asked if the Count had thought about what Elena had said, and about redemption and hope, and the possibility of change. The Count nodded slowly. He said he had thought of little else for 3 days. Elena's words had awakened something in him, some small spark of the man he had been. But he did not know if that spark was enough. If 3 centuries of darkness could truly be overcome, if a soul could be saved after so much had been lost. The priest said that he had come to offer a choice, but not the choices previously offered. He said that if the Count was willing to truly repent, to accept full responsibility for all his sins without excuses or justifications, to submit himself to God's judgment, whatever that judgment might be, then Father Constantine would help him, not by destroying him, but by helping him find whatever path to redemption might still exist. The Count asked what that path would entail. Father Constantine admitted he did not know. The Church had procedures for exorcism, for destruction, but not for the redemption of the undead. They would be walking an untrodden path, trusting in faith and prayer and the belief that God's mercy was indeed infinite. It would require the Count to resist his nature, to refuse the hunger even unto starvation, to suffer without the relief of feeding. It might take years, decades, perhaps centuries, and there was no guarantee it would work. The Count was silent for a long time. Then he asked what would happen if he tried and failed, if the hunger overwhelmed him and he killed again. Father Constantine said honestly that he would then have no choice but to destroy him, that mercy could not extend to enabling further evil. The Count would be gambling everything on an uncertain outcome, trusting that the remnant of humanity within him was strong enough to prevail against the curse. The Count walked to the window and looked out at the valley below, at the village lights beginning to appear in the gathering darkness. He said that Elena had been right about one thing. He had used his damnation as an excuse, had convinced himself that he was beyond redemption as a way to avoid trying. It was easier to be a monster than to struggle against monstrosity, easier to embrace the darkness than to fight for the light. But she had also been right that he still possessed compassion, still remembered love, still felt the weight of his sins. Those things would not exist in something truly beyond redemption. They were signs that his soul, however corrupted, still existed, still yearned for grace even if it could not fully comprehend what grace meant anymore. He turned back to Father Constantine and said he would try. He would accept whatever suffering was required, would resist the hunger until it destroyed him or he mastered it, would trust in God's mercy even though he had no reason to believe that mercy would be extended to him. It was a fool's hope, but as Elena had said, sometimes the foolish choice was the right one. Father Constantine felt tears prick his eyes. He said that the church would support this attempt, that he would work with the Count to develop rituals and prayers that might strengthen his resistance, that might help purify whatever remained of his soul. But they had to begin immediately, because the mayor was planning something, and once Octavian acted, all choices would be foreclosed. The Count said he knew about the mayor's plans, had sensed the gathering of armed men, the stockpiling of oil and pitch. He could stop it easily, could kill Octavian and his mercenaries before they ever reached the castle. But that would be reverting to the monster, would be choosing violence over faith. If he was to have any hope of redemption, he had to let go of power and trust in something greater than himself. They spent the next hours in prayer and discussion, priest and vampire working together to forge a path that neither fully understood. Father Constantine taught the Count prayers he had forgotten, reminded him of the rituals and sacraments of his lost faith. The Count submitted to these teachings with humility that seemed strange in a creature of such terrible power, but which revealed the depth of his desire for change. As midnight approached, they heard sounds from outside, torches, many of them, and the tramp of boots, and voices raised in anger and fear. Octavian's mercenaries had arrived earlier than expected, and with them came the mayor himself, ready to watch the destruction of his enemy. The Count and Father Constantine went to the courtyard. They found it surrounded by armed men, perhaps 50 of them, professional soldiers hired from distant cities. These were not frightened peasants with pitchforks, but hardened warriors who had fought in real wars. They carried crossbows loaded with blessed bolts, swords that had been consecrated, and barrels of oil mixed with holy water. Octavian stood among them, his face triumphant. He shouted that the time for talking was over, that the creature's corruption of his daughter and manipulation of the priest ended tonight. The castle would burn, and with it would burn the last threat to his authority. He gave the order to begin spreading the oil. Father Constantine stepped forward and commanded them to stop in the name of the church. He said that the Count had agreed to submit to penance, to attempt redemption through faith and prayer, and that destroying him now would be murder, not justice. But Octavian laughed and said that the priest had been bewitched, just as Eleanor had been, that his judgment could not be trusted. The mayor produced a letter, sealed with the bishop's seal, giving him authority to act if the church failed to do its duty. Father Constantine stared at the letter in shock. He said it was a forgery, that the bishop would never authorize such an action. But Octavian just smiled. Forgery or not, who would question it? Who would investigate? By the time anyone from the church hierarchy arrived, the castle would be ashes and the creature within it destroyed. The mayor would be hailed as a hero who saved the valley from an ancient evil. The soldiers began spreading oil, working efficiently, professionally. The Count watched without moving, without speaking. Father Constantine pleaded with him to flee, to use his powers to escape, to save himself. But the Count shook his head. If he ran now, he would be running forever, would abandon the one chance at redemption he had been offered. He would stay and trust in God's will. The priest fell to his knees and began to pray, his voice rising in desperate supplication. He prayed for a miracle, for divine intervention, for anything that might stop this atrocity. The Count knelt beside him, adding his voice to the prayers, words he had not spoken in 3 centuries, words that felt like broken glass in his mouth, but which he forced out nonetheless. And then, from the darkness beyond the torchlight, came Elena's voice. She was running up the mountain road, having finally escaped her prison through means she would later refuse to explain. She was screaming at her father to stop, to listen, to understand what he was doing. But Octavian ignored her, ordering his men to restrain her, to keep her away from the castle. The soldiers grabbed Elena and she struggled against them, tears streaming down her face. She cried out to the Count, begging him to save himself, to fight, to do something. The Count looked at her across the courtyard, and his expression was gentle. He told her not to grieve, that whatever happened was what needed to happen, that her compassion had given him something precious in his final hours. Hope. the knowledge that even the damned could be seen as worthy of redemption by at least one pure soul. Octavian gave the order to light the fires. The soldiers put torches to the oil-soaked walls, and flames roared to life, climbing the ancient stones with unnatural speed. The heat was immediate and intense, driving everyone back. The Count and Father Constantine remained in the courtyard, surrounded by rising fire, still praying, still trusting. Elena screamed and fought against the men holding her. She managed to break free and ran toward the flames, but strong hands caught her and pulled her back. Stefan, Father Constantine's young acolyte, had arrived with several men from the village, had seen what was happening and intervened. They held Elena as she collapsed, sobbing, watching the castle burn. Inside the inferno, the Count felt the fire begin to consume him. Holy fire burned differently than normal flames. It did not just destroy the body, but attacked the curse itself, unraveling the dark magic that sustained his immortality. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything he had endured in 3 centuries of suffering, but he did not scream. He did not beg for mercy. He continued praying, his voice growing weaker as his body began to fail. Father Constantine remained beside him, though the heat was overwhelming, though the smoke choked his lungs. He would not abandon this soul in its final moments, would not let the Count face judgment alone. They prayed together as the flames rose higher, as the ancient stones began to crack and fall, as 300 years of cursed existence burned away, and in that moment, as the Count's body began to disintegrate, as the fire consumed the last vestiges of his immortal flesh, something happened. The curse, which had bound him for so long, suddenly broke. Not because of the fire, though that was part of it, but because the Count had finally, truly, completely let go. He had surrendered power, embraced suffering, trusted in mercy without demanding guarantee. He had made the choice that 3 centuries ago he had refused to make. He had chosen faith over certainty, love over fear, grace over damnation. The fire that had been consuming him suddenly changed. It became pure white light, so bright that everyone watching had to shield their eyes. The light rose from the castle like a pillar connecting earth to heaven, and within it, for just a moment, those watching swore they saw a figure. Not the Count, as he had been in his cursed form, but a young man in armor standing straight and proud, his face at peace. And beside him, a woman with kind eyes, reaching out her hand to him. Then the light faded and the fire died, and where the castle had stood was only rubble and ash. Father Constantine emerged from the ruins, his robes scorched but otherwise unharmed, his face streaked with tears and soot. He carried something in his hands, the Count's violin, somehow intact despite the inferno, and the old Bible, its pages unburned. He walked slowly down the mountain to where Eleanor knelt in the road, and he placed the violin in her hands. He told her that the Count was gone, truly gone, but that at the end he had found what he sought. Not destruction, but transformation. Not damnation, but grace. The proof was in the light they had all witnessed, in the peace on his face as the curse broke, in the figure of the woman who had come to meet him. Elena held the violin and wept, not from grief, but from a complex mixture of sorrow and joy. The Count had been saved, but the cost had been his existence. She would never speak with him again, never hear his music, never see that sad smile, but she had helped save a soul, had proven that compassion could reach even the damned, and that was worth any price. Octavian Gregor stood among the ruins of his victory and found it hollow. He had destroyed the threat to his power, but in doing so, he had lost everything that mattered. His daughter looked at him with contempt. The priest regarded him with pity. The villagers who had witnessed the pillar of light whispered that the mayor had murdered a soul seeking redemption, had committed a sin that would follow him to his grave and beyond. His power began to crumble in the days that followed. People refused to pay their rents. They denied his authority. They turned to Father Constantine for guidance instead of to him. Within a year, Octavian Gregor was a broken man, drinking himself to death in his empty manor, haunted by the memory of that white light and the knowledge of what he had destroyed. Elena never married. She devoted her life to helping those in need, to showing compassion to the outcast and the damned, to proving that redemption was possible for anyone who truly sought it. She kept the Count's violin, and sometimes late at night she would play it, and the music that came from it was beautiful and sad and full of hope. Father Constantine lived many more years, and he spent them writing down what had happened, creating a record so that future generations might learn from it. He wrote that the Church's understanding of redemption was incomplete, that grace worked in mysterious ways, that even the most damned soul could find salvation if it surrendered pride and embraced faith. His writings were controversial, were suppressed by church authorities, but copies survived, hidden in archives, waiting for a time when the world might be ready to hear the truth. The castle was never rebuilt. The ruins stood on the mountain as a reminder of what had transpired there, of the battle between darkness and light, between damnation and redemption. Local legend said that on certain nights when the moon was full, you could hear violin music coming from the ruins, beautiful and haunting, and those who heard it would be moved to tears without knowing why. Elena died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 70, and on her deathbed she smiled and whispered that she saw him again, the young man in armor, waiting to thank her for believing in him when no one else would. Father Constantine, who attended her final moments, said that her face in death was radiant with joy, and he had no doubt that she had been granted a vision of paradise. As for the Count, no one could say for certain what became of his soul. Some believed he had been granted mercy, had been forgiven and allowed into heaven. Others thought he was still serving penance, working to atone for his sins in some realm between earth and eternity. But everyone who had witnessed that pillar of white light agreed on one thing. Whatever judgment he faced it with a soul that had been cleansed by fire and transformed by love. He had been given a second chance, and he had not wasted it. The village of Valchia continued, seasons turning, generations passing, the old stories fading into legend. But the lesson remained, preserved in Father Constantine's hidden writings, in the violin that was eventually donated to the church, in the memories passed down through families who had witnessed the impossible. Evil could be redeemed, damnation was not eternal, and sometimes the greatest power in the world was not strength or immortality or magic, but simple compassion offered to those who least deserved it. In the end, Count Dracula had been saved not by holy fire or ancient rituals, but by a young woman who had seen past the monster to the suffering soul within, and by a priest who had been willing to believe that God's mercy extended even to the undead. It was a small miracle in a dark world, but it was enough. It had to be enough. The castle ruins still stand today, overgrown with ivy, home to birds and small animals, a place of quiet peace rather than darkness and dread. And sometimes travelers passing by swear they hear music, faint and distant, the sound of a violin played by someone who loved and lost, and found redemption in the very fires meant to destroy him. It is perhaps a fitting epitaph for a soul that learned, after 3 centuries of darkness, what it truly meant to be human.